Hello and welcome to the fourth of 8 presentations in the 2021 Great Decisions Lecture Series. My name is Matthew Hughes and I serve as the Executive Director of the International Relations Council in Kansas City, and we're so glad to have you with us here today. The International Relations Council strengthens Kansas City's global perspective by maintaining an active dialogue around world events, global issues, and their impact on our community. As a nonpartisan educational nonprofit organization, the IRC values informed civil discourse, accessibility, and substance as we work to sharpen our community's 21st century global acumen. We invite you to learn more about the International Relations Council, including other upcoming events, information on joining a Great Decisions discussion group, and how to join the IRC as a member on our website at irckc.org. For decades, the annual Great Decisions Briefing Book has framed informed civil discussions about critical international issues. Groups around the country, including here in the Kansas City metro area, meet in coffee shops, conference rooms, and now virtually to explore these issues together and distill policy recommendations and future outlooks. To support their exploration and to bring the larger community into the discussion, the International Relations Council is proud to offer a series of conversations with respected experts through 2021 on the year's 8 Great Decisions topics. We warmly welcome diverse perspectives and invite your engagement with these foreign policy issues from work, from home, or wherever you might be. We hope you'll engage with us today as we explore China's role in Africa. We know that many in the audience have already discussed this topic with their local Great Decisions group, so we certainly welcome your thoughtful questions throughout the course of the conversation using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. And do check out and share the other conversations in the Great Decisions Lecture Series as we consider a range of critical foreign policy issues in the coming months. We're grateful to our sponsors who have made today's program and the Great Decisions Lecture Series possible. In particular, thanks to sustaining series sponsors Cyprian Simkowitz and Jerry White, and supporting series sponsor Nancy C. Messer. We also appreciate the support of the IRC's past board presidents who serve as today's global conversation sponsor. Thank you for finding value in these discussions. I'm now pleased to introduce our moderator for today's program, who will introduce our speaker and help us navigate the conversation. Dr. Lina Ben Abdullah is Assistant Professor of Politics and International Affairs at Wake Forest University. Her current book project examines China's multilateral foreign policy in continental Africa and seeks to theorize the power dynamics within the seemingly equal global South diplomatic relations. Her fieldwork research areas include China, Ethiopia, and Kenya. At Wake Forest, she teaches courses in international relations, African studies, and international studies, and she holds a PhD from the University of Florida. Dr. Ben Abdullah, thank you so much for being with us today. Please take it away.
Good afternoon to everyone. Thank you, Matthew, so much for this introduction. I would like to thank you all for the invitation. It is my pleasure to be with you today to have this very important conversation. It is my distinct honor to introduce our speaker, Florindo Chivucute, who is the founder and executive director of Friends of Angola, FOA, and Paginas Tech, activist and blogger. Florindo earned his master's degree in conflict analysis and resolution from George Mason University and has over 6 years of experience working in nonprofit organizations, international development, international relations, peace building, and education, while being active in the community of Portuguese-speaking countries, CPLP, in the United States. We are extremely fortunate to have Florindo join us today to share some of his expertise and thoughts on China-Africa relations. So I will invite him to make a few opening remarks, and then we will engage in a moderated discussion. Florindo, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Lina. It's a pleasure to be here, and for all the team, everyone who made this possible today, I'm equally grateful for that. I think very often we talk about China it's definitely something that I see in particular within foreign affairs, people more interested to learn more and to understand better this relationship between the continent and China. Just to give you some very important details in terms of growth, overall economic relationship between Angola and Africa and China. So Africa has become the fastest urbanizing region in the world. There is a lot of folks migrating from rural areas to the cities, and that has been presented as an opportunity and also a struggle for a lot of the countries within the continent to accommodate all these flux of migrants on urban areas, really trying to build up the infrastructure needed in order to accommodate thousands and thousands of people migrating every single year. It's also really growing, rapidly growing. Youth, for the most part, is very young. Countries you will find within the continent in Africa, the population is extremely young, and so that also presents an opportunity for some states within the continent, and to some extent, and also a challenge as well. Just to give you an idea, by 2015, Africa will have 1.1 billion person population, will double, according to McKinsey. And 80% of the growth is happening in cities. So the urban areas is really having exponential growth. And so a lot of these, a lot of governments within the continent trying to see how they can develop the infrastructure, so provide more jobs, more opportunities, and they're looking all over the places. And China seems to me so far a country that is answering most of those questions throughout the continent, how to rebuild those infrastructure and how to provide more opportunities. Now the question really is whether those are sustainable, and that's something we can discuss throughout this webinar. So you have those construction, and you will see, depending on where you are within the continent, if you see a large construction, whether it's a building or it's a road, most likely there is a Chinese company or engineer operating to build those infrastructure throughout the continent. So in China has become the largest trading partner for the continent by far, in comparison with Europe and the U.S. I will not go into details because I will not take a lot of, I wouldn't want to talk all the time to the webinar. I'm sure we will have time to interact more, but the Sino-Africa trade, it's topping 200 billion per year. There's a lot of business. I'll stop for here for now.
Thank you so much, Florindo, for this wonderful preliminary presentation. So you talk about infrastructure a lot. I would like for you maybe to contextualize this for our audience a little bit. So can you tell us a little bit about how China has become such a significant player in Africa's infrastructure scene? So how old is this when we're talking about sort of this booming relationship between China and African countries in terms of infrastructure? So how old is this? And also, how has China become such a significant player and actor in Africa when it comes to infrastructure? So what is China's advantage in this area? How is it able to reach this level of influence?
Well, I think in part, so the relationship between the continent and China has been probably no more than 30 or 40 years. And so in China, not too long ago, went through the same thing that a lot of those African states or countries, if you will, they're going through right now, underdeveloped, need of infrastructure in order to diversify the economy. And so China was able to do all that not too long ago. And so they have a lot of experience to share, and they can relate to a lot of those states throughout the continent. And so the only question is whether this relationship has been an equal relationship, and who's the winner and who are the losers, this relationship. But we talk about I mean, I don't know, I think it was the 1940s when Chinese started lobbying the continent to recognize the Chinese government, and they really have done an excellent work in terms of lobbying those African leaders throughout the continent, and I think it's paying off right now, and that's why you see pretty much everywhere throughout the continent, you will find the Chinese business, whether it's paid by the state, the Chinese state, or a pure entrepreneurship Chinese. That's sometimes a difficult question to answer, because there's no clear line between a private and public sector. But either way, the Chinese government is winning what has been doing within the continent, for sure.
Yes, I think it's also, I very much like when you were describing that China went through a very similar experience that a lot of African countries are going through today in terms of their development. I think this is a point that gets sometimes lost. It gets underemphasized, and I think it's a very important point, which is to say, for a lot of African governments, peoples, elites, China represents an aspiration precisely because it's not long ago that China has implemented this development model that was able to help Chinese people move basically millions of people from under the poverty line and then reach very impressive levels of development. So we often hear people in African countries compare China from 30, 40 years ago to a lot of cities and a lot of countries and a lot of familiar. So that familiarity, I think, of experience is very important, that China can say, you know, that China has been through this not long ago. And like, for example, you know, and like IMF or World Bank models for development, you can say that they are far away from the experience of a lot of African countries, so much so that they don't resonate with the people as much. So there's certainly this advantage of familiarity, of the resonating model of development that China has throughout Africa. I would like to ask you a question about this development model. What do you think about it? So yeah, you talk about the past experience. I think that's what the development model is. What do you think about the extent to which China's development model can or cannot be applicable? I want to caveat, of course, that Africa is a continent, 54 countries, very different landscapes, histories, and regimes of governance. But overall, when we talk about the China model, can you tell us a little bit about your thoughts on the China, the so-called China model, and the extent of its applicability to the African experience, whether there are parts of it that are more applicable than others, or not at all, or what your thoughts are on this?
Yeah, I mean that's a very good question, and I think so. They have designed this economic model that is very sometimes it's very blurred because you never know. I mean, you cannot distinguish between the state and the private sector, right? So it's very hard. But either way, what they're doing throughout the continent. It's some folks they would describe this as a new form of colonialism, and the others would say no. Well, there's a lot of the African countries can win from this. Well, except the leaders have to make sure they whenever they close those business they are looking for the best interest for their own people. But let's just take a step back for a second and just look what they have done in different places. Um, so, so in Angola, for instance, what they have in the beginning, and by the way, Angola has the largest debt in with throughout the continent, and it's astonishing how we came to those numbers not too long ago in a very short period of time, but we do have. And then when you come to Angola and you see the roads they have built, most of them they are gone. They are no longer here. So they it's really the buildings that they have built here in Angola. A lot of them they are really falling apart. Now the model they have adopted is that the money never goes out to China. So they offer loans with low interest rate, lower than IMF, other banks, and they say, well, how many buildings do you want? How many kilometers of road do you want? And so they give you the money, and they also in the past probably in Angola has shifted a little bit, but the labor would come also from China. So the money never leaves China. So Angola never had the opportunity to create a middle class in order to give opportunities to local business to build those infrastructure, so they could grow and they could help build the middle class. So they lent the money to the Chinese, and that happened in Angola when at the end of the civil war in 2002, the former president Dos Santos was looking for loans, and and he went to IMF, he went to World Bank, and they were asking a lot of questions. So and then he went to Chinese, so they don't ask too many questions. There's nothing human rights, that's not their concern. Democracy, that's not their concern. They want to do business, and sometimes they don't really care. The corruption, like how much you could claim the road would cost, and how much indeed you would factor in and kind of have that pay set, those payback. So it's an interesting model because the money never leaves China. So, and there's really a small portion of funds probably come to places where they're investing. The labor, for the most part, comes from China as well, because they're also helping local business in China by employing their own citizens and nationals. So it's a model that works well for China for sure, and that's why we have seen the Chinese economy growing really fast in a short period of time. And so, but for countries that like Angola, like probably South Africa, even places like Liberia, other places. Probably the most common example that I would use is Ethiopia, because it's so large, and in Nigeria, that's more visible. You can see and you can compare and contrast. So a lot of the projects they've built, I mean, the budget went over budget. And we don't talk about small amounts of funds. I mean, we talk about large, and they have accumulated debt in short period of time. So that's where the terminology of debt trap has come from, and have created, a lot of people start scratching their heads and say, well, it's really good for the continent, or for some of those countries that I know they are trying to develop their own infrastructure. There are good intentions, but for what price? And the quality of a lot of those roads and infrastructure they're building, it's a disaster, because that's something I've seen it in Angola. And yeah, I mean, the model, I think it's really good for Chinese, and it's difficult to tell whether it's pure market, or it's like a hybrid where you have market-based, and also you have some form of the government heavily involved in all aspects of the business for the most part, not just in China, but throughout the continent as well.
Yes, thank you. I want to pick up on the question of debt. I think a lot of our audience might be very curious to discuss this a little bit further. I wonder if you can share a bit more about, you mentioned that debt in Angola is particularly elevated and high when compared to other countries in the continent. Can you comment on what your thoughts are on the situation of debt? Who does Angola owe its debt to? Is it mostly to China? Is it to private creditors? Is it to other governments? What does the landscape look like? And also, tell our audience a bit about this debt trap. I'm sure it is probably a language that came up in looking up China-Africa relations. But what's the research on the debt trap? What does it say about the relationship between China and African countries?
So that's something that keeps a lot of people awake, and because that in Angola in particular, because there's no transparency, so it's hard to tell who the Angolan government owes the most, because there is no really transparency, and so where we know that a lot of reports have stated is that the Angola has the largest debt throughout the continent, 54 states or nations, if you will. And for such a small country, no more than probably 32 million people, with tons of natural resources. Now, so because of the lack of transparency from both sides, from the Angolan government and the Chinese government, it's really hard to tell. I will just give you an example. Not too long ago, the president of the World Bank, he mentioned that. He said, well, I mean, how can we help you, Angolan government, if you cannot even tell us how much you owe? That's just unheard of. But that's really true. We don't know. And when unlike democratic states like the U.S. and a lot of European states, you could go and you could ask questions, not to the Chinese government. And I work for an NGO, we could write a letter, we could ask a question to U.S. Department of State, we could ask it to Treasury government, and if they don't ask questions, we have other venues to try to find information. And a lot of those information, they're up there for people consumption. But the Chinese side, that's not the case. So there's it's very opaque. This relationship is very opaque. And so it's really hard to tell. But one thing we know for sure is that the Chinese government needs Africa to keep growing its economy for geostrategic political strategy. They need the continent because we have tremendous, it used to be in the past, during colonialism, it continues to be. Africa has basically all the natural resources that they need to keep growing. And so, but going back to your main question, it's really hard to tell because there's no transparency. So we can only talk these in vague terms. We cannot give numbers because they don't really exist. There's no place to find. I mean, unless probably if you work for government officials, you have access to this type of information. You probably can tell. But as far as I know, I haven't seen any report or article that could, or even a book that I could read and I could learn more about who's the Angolan government owns. But it has been a problem, not just for the Angolan government, but throughout the continent. The debt trap basically is the Chinese investment in Angola, whether it's public or private. Now, I don't want to say all the investment that come to Angola or throughout the continent are public or the Chinese government investing, but I don't think that's true. There's also private Chinese business come investing throughout the continent, including Angola. But the problem is, it's really hard to distinguish who's who. Who's the private Chinese business? Who's the government-owned business investing in Angola? And just because of the lack of transparency as well. But the debt trap basically is they coming to places like Angola. They invest. They are providing those loans. And sometimes the budget goes way over the intended, and it just get out of control to the point where in such a short period of time, those countries accumulated a tremendous amount of debt that they cannot pay. They cannot pay. In Angola, got to the point where we have to give them not oil. And probably other natural resources, but oil is the most common because that we are one of the large producers of oil. In other places throughout the continent, that might be the case as well. So that's the debt trap, and so we talk about generations of Angolans. We've been spending time and paying this debt, and unfortunately, things continue to be the same way. I mean, no one is really talking about it. The government, the Angolan government, is not providing enough information. The debts keep growing, and so I'm not sure where are we going to be. Probably 5-10 years from now. As many Angolans like to say, well, the Chinese own us, and there's some truth into that. And I don't think Angola is the only country throughout the continent that feel in the same place. So it's really a debt trap, and I don't think and I don't think that those investments are feasible. And one could ask, well, but those government officials are making those deals. They should be responsible as well. That's true. But the reality is that a lot of those because those deals are so opaque, it's really hard to know the details of those agreements and whether the money that has been borrowed on behalf of Angolans or some other countries, they have been indeed spending in to build infrastructure in Angola, because there is also a lot of illicit financial flow back and forth. So it's really hard to tell where's this money going, and what is really China is up to in the continent.
Thank you so much for that. Connected to the question of natural resources, so you mentioned that Angola is particularly endowed in terms of access to natural resources and to oil, and because of that, it's able to engage in various negotiations and trade deals with China as well as other partners. What is your thought on African countries that are extremely rich in natural resources and minerals that are not necessarily able to really unlock the potential of having access to cobalt, to mineral resources that are extremely important to China and other partners to actually leverage those in their relations to China? So why are we not able as Africans to use access to these mineral resources and rare earths and natural resources that are extremely rare, to use them to our advantage in terms of these deals, in terms of these negotiations that, as you pointed out, often end up, because of transparency issues and opacity, end up leading to huge amounts of debt?
Yeah, well, I think to a large extent, it's really has to do with the corruption. It's really corruption that is trapping us from benefiting from our natural resources. In Angola, for instance, we talk about billions and billions of dollars that have been that left in the country, end up in places like Europe, including U.S., buying real estates, those government officials. Not just in Europe, you'll be surprised. I mean, in the U.S., it has been one of the main recipients of those illicit financial flows. And the government official buying a lot of real estate from Angolan officials, and that the same is true either from Equatorial Guinea or Ethiopia. I mean, you name it. I mean, for a lot of those states, and so it's really hard to develop a nation when you have a tremendous amount of corruption. On starting with on leadership, and so whatever deals they are doing with the Chinese government, and that's why they have chosen, because they have the option to choose between U.S. or Europe or Chinese. Now they have all those options. They're choosing Chinese because they allow them to operate within this opacity, within this very obscure environment where they don't have to be transparent at all. They don't have to to share all the data needed for us to keep tracking how much they're receiving and how much they're spending for infrastructure, or for you to build a human capital. So I think corruption is the main source. I'm sorry, it's the main source, and with that also comes the illicit financial flow, which is there's a lot of data that shows the amount of the dollar amount that leaving the continent every year. We talk about billions and billions of dollars. So it's impossible for locals to benefit from when you have it's just unbelievable and tremendous amount of corruption. And it's eroding. It's not just that. The problem is that it's not just Angolans not benefiting from. It's also the problem. The whatever where you are within the continent, it's also eroding democracy as well. And a lot of those states, including Angola, democracy is so young. I mean, it cannot really flourish because you have all these impediments. It's almost like we are going backwards, if you will, not just of economic development, but also in terms of political freedom, democracy, freedom of expression, and freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, and so on and so forth. It's like autocracy is taking over all these neo-democratic states that we were hoping that by now probably we would be in a different place. Um, it's just not a good picture.
Yeah, and speaking of these freedoms you just mentioned, especially freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, freedoms, and democracy, and these values that you mentioned, leads me to ask my my next question, which is about so these values often are the topic of controversy and also of tensions in terms of China-US relations, especially as we have seen recently restrictions on Huawei, for example, and other technologies by the US government, precisely because of these the perceived different values that are pushed through the Chinese model of governance, and including that technology. So I'll ask here the question, and we'll turn it over soon to Q&A from our audience, but this will be my final question to you directly. What can you say to us about this technology? So what are the pros and cons of Africa collaborating with Chinese technology companies? Do you foresee other tech companies acting as competitors, and why, if so, and what is your comment on sort of the advantages, disadvantages of this technology when it comes to these values you were just talking about?
Well, I mean, if you ask anyone, an ordinary person, depending where you are, whether you want to be, you want to live in a free society or you want to be in a oppressed society, I'm sure that the answer is very clear. So the problem, the relationship, the only equal relationship, I would say, between China and Africa, it doesn't just end on economics, right? It's also infringing our rights, because there's a lot of technology that a lot of autocrats have been buying from Chinese government, that very sophisticated technology, I would say, that is helping those autocrats regime to control more than before, more than control, to infringe on a lot of those, the privacy rights. In places like Angola, because the laws are so very clear, and sometimes the government doesn't have to, doesn't have to be to go to court, for instance, to read my text message or to get access to my Facebook account or WhatsApp. So that has been very problematic. Now, if that company was a US company, we as a civil society, we can hold them accountable. And that's the benefit of places like US or even within Europe, probably not all them, but some of them, that there is avenues that you could use to hold those companies accountable, because they are being used to infringe on a citizen's right. They are being used to really strangle democracy in so many ways. Now, with the Chinese government, that's different. I mean, the Chinese government is not going to those places throughout the continent to sell democratic values. On the contrary, they are doing business, but they also, it's very clear, it's a communist regime. Now, you could say, well, it's a hybrid, but that's not a problem. They will sell those technology to wherever who they want to, and they don't ask questions what they pretend to do with this technology. And the consequences are very visible in a lot of places, including in Angola, where people are living in fear. Activists are being, journalists, they are being, they social media account, they cell phones have been constantly hacked, and so it's really a big price that we are paying for. And if you write a letter to the Chinese government, ask, well, why would you sell this technology to a government who doesn't have a good records in terms of respecting their citizens' right, whether it's freedom of speech, assembly, freedom of religion, and so on and so forth. They will not answer you. In fact, we have written several letters to ambassador here in Angola. He never responded. Even to other agencies. Now, if that's different from the U.S. for sure, because and we as an NGO, we have avenues. We could take probably that company to court that offering this technology. But in short, we are paying a high price for that, and because those technologies have been used to infringe on our rights, and it's not good for democracy, and it's not good for anyone who live in a place where they know they are being constantly monitored in every step in their lives. So it's just no good feeling living with fear.
Yeah, I'll have to say the probably the flip side to add to that is the flip side is actually just access. It's access to phones that are able to do, and basically, smartphones that are able to get mobile, digital economy, are able to get people to start apps, to start businesses, to actually access that infrastructure is also important, whether it's by Huawei or ZTE. I've seen that in Algeria, for example. I want to say every single internet router that I've seen is a Huawei single router, not because there are no options in the US, but those options are just not available. They just don't exist, or they are so expensive, they're prohibitive, so you're not able to access that infrastructure. So it's absolutely interesting to see the pros and cons. I think with this, we should be able to give a bit of floor to pass on the questions of our audience to you, Florindo. So I'll just scroll a bit, probably, if you don't mind. Would you actually, Florindo, would you prefer me to read you a question at a time, or do you want me to send you a couple your way and then you tackle them, or how do you want to proceed?
If it's okay with you, Dr. Lina, one at a time.
One at a time sounds good. Okay, perfect. All right. So I'll start with this question that says, so there are a couple of questions from the audience that focus on infrastructure. So this has been very interesting to the audience, obviously. So I'll ask a few questions on infrastructure and then we'll move on. The question here we have from Daniel says, does the research indicate that the infrastructure programs you mentioned are having an economic impact? So is Belt and Road a viable strategy for national economic development?
Yeah, I mean, in theory, I think the infrastructure were supposed to help the local economy to grow. The problem is the quality of the roads. That's really the problem, because some of them they didn't last more than 2 years. If the price tag as well, right? So we talk about let's say a road. We talk about very often in Angola we like to pay about a billionaire road that lasted in 6 months, right? I mean, so this is actual not helping the economy. On the contrary, it's really creating a lot of issues.
Yeah, so a similar question here is also about infrastructure, but then it asks a bit about that transfer of expertise. And the question is asking, does China provide, this question by Teresa, does China provide any incubators or other ways to develop local, long-term, sustainable entities associated with infrastructure development?
Not from what I know. If it exists, probably I'm not aware of. But my experience is that that's not the case.
Have you noticed any transfers of skills with these infrastructure developments?
Well, I mean, as I alluded to in the beginning, this discussion, so most of the employees, the labor, they came from China. So it's hard for me to imagine if 80% or 70% of the labor coming from China to build a road. I'm not sure how much these not technology, but know-how transfer would happen. If it does, it probably in a very low pace, but not to the extent that we would like to see.
Okay, one more question about infrastructure, and then we'll try to shift gears a bit. So this is a question from Jeff, who asks says your description of infrastructure investments by China in Africa is very interesting. The question is, to what extent has China provided military equipment and training to African countries in exchange or payback for infrastructure investments? If you're aware of any such thing.
No, I'm not, and it probably also because of it's a very opaque relationship. It's not like when the U.S. sells arms. I mean, there's a report coming out, and we know how much it costs and how many airplanes they have bought. And if there's this information available somewhere, I would love to see it, but not that I'm aware.
Okay, I'm going to ask a long question. It's asked by Baraza African Cultures Center. So if you want to follow along, it's that question. The center says thank you for talking about the predicament African countries, businesses are in when it comes to development and so on. World Bank, etc., make it difficult to move things ahead where China comes in early and comes in cheap. They often seem to be the only ones stepping up, basically the only game in town in many cases. The sad thing is the long-term negative impact that comes from these relationships. China will end up owning Africa. So basically the Angolan saying that you shared with us earlier. So what is the answer, not just for African governments, but for African businesses to procure investment for development and other business?
Well, I mean, I think so. I think U.S. and Europe and other continents, South America, they even within the continent, African continent, there's a lot of opportunity for business. The problem, like someone alluded to, is that they come out in cheap, right? They're always able to undercut the other the competition, and because in part there's a heavy hand of the state involved. And this has been a source of conflict, not just in the continent, even other places throughout the world. And it's a very unequal competition. And yes, there's a vacuum. There's a vacuum. But my recommendation to anyone business who do business, who like to do business outside the Chinese, I would say, go to those embassies, talk to them. Usually they have someone who economic affairs, who can give you a lot of information. In the U.S., for instance, has Angola. It's a U.S. done a partnership with different states in the continent that facilitated the import of goods with really low taxes, or even and it's just to really helping local economies to grow. The problem is not many people know about those tools exist. Mm-hmm. And it's not just that the business folks need to do more research, and if it's a small business, you really don't have the manpower to do that. And if you're in Angola, then that's very problematic because we speak Portuguese, and English is not our it's not just a really official language. Not too many people speak English, so it's really hard. It probably, I would say, you know, those government, including U.S. government, they need to start reach out to those business, because that's what the Chinese government have been doing. Yes, they come out and sometimes very cheap, but also there's a vacuum. And that's how the Chinese business are growing here throughout the continent, because there's really a vacuum. We need a serious, a very, I would say, a very careful approach on how states like the US or states within the EU could do business. Not the way they used to. They need to change the approach. It's not working, and it's really, they're falling behind, and that's why the Chinese business are striving. Now, it's good to have competition. I like competition. I don't want to say the government should leave once, but what I would like to see more is everyone in town, then people can choose and pick who they want to do business with them. But there's a lot of work that either both the US government, EU governments need to do in order to be an equal level with the Chinese. And some has to do with information as well, reaching out, do a lot of, you know, I mean, reaching out campaign and just understanding that the continent is growing very fast. It's the urbanizing, and that's also a very, it's a potential source for business, and change this approach. It's about time. It's about time. Because those things don't happen in a vacuum. The Chinese business, they are not striving in a vacuum. It's because also either the US or the EU governments, they are not doing their best in order to reach out and compete on equal level throughout the continent.
Definitely, absolutely. Okay, we have a question that I personally like very much. I think is a very good and very important question. It's asked by Bill and Marge. The question says, are there African organizations that attempt to collectively address the Chinese investment problem? And Florindo, as you know, is very common in the China-Africa circles that there is always a China policy and China position on Africa, but there's hardly ever sort of an African paper or African policy or African position on China. So what can you say about sort of this question of collectively addressing, collectively negotiating with China and Chinese investments?
So, I mean, so this is where probably the Angolan, not just Angolan, but the African leaders, they need to reach out to universities. They need to reach out to academic communities and international partners to learn really and how they can best negotiate for the interest of their own people. Because you need to do a lot of research. You need to be prepared in order to be negotiating on equal level. But this also, believe or not, this also comes down to democratic values. If you have a leader who have been elected official by the population and he is being held accountable, probably he or she is more likely to make sure that whatever business they are doing, it will be for the best, will be to serve their own people, not just for the interest of few individuals. But then if you have a society, a country where the government doesn't really have to, or no one hold them accountable, in an autocratic regime, it's really hard to tell because they don't care. At the end of the day, what they would like to see is the money on the bank account. But they need to reach out to the academic community, and sometimes within their own countries. and make sure they get the help they need in order to negotiating on an equal level with the Chinese government.
Indeed. So we have time only for one more question. So when conversation is good, time just flies by. So we unfortunately cannot get through all of the questions asked. I'll finish with this question from Chris. Do African nations worry about becoming dependent on exports to China and the leverage that would give China in resolving contractual business disputes, or even allowing African nations to exercise their own foreign policies and sovereignty?
Yeah, I mean, the short answer to this question is yes, absolutely. I was just giving an example. I was talking to a friend who we were colleagues, and I was doing my master's degree, was doing his PhD, and we were just talking, and a few years ago, and he was telling me how in Ghana, the Chinese boats would come, take the fish from the shores, from the Ghanaian territory, and then they would prepare the fish, and they would put in cans or whatever, and they would sell to Ghanaian market. The example we give here, for instance, would be the tomatoes that we don't have a tomato paste. And throughout the continent, we use a lot of tomato paste for cooking. If you never had a chance to see it, if you go to Africa, probably one of those, you will see how much we use tomato paste. But exactly, that's what happened. And there's a dependency that comes with a price, right? So a lot of the policies that have been creating, they're being shaped to a large extent by the Chinese influence. In Angola, that's definitely the case, and you can see that, there's no doubt. And that's problematic, because then you really, you really know independent state, right? Independent country, because you now you're owned by another state, and you have to do whatever they please. So that's very problematic, and that's not good for democracy as well, and that's not what we want. And because we have seen that in the past, it didn't work so well, and we want to make sure we keep repeating the same mistakes. I think at the end of the day, I think we have there's a lot of blame to share around, and to be fair, and I think it's important for all of us to take responsibility, not just for the Chinese and the African leaders. Some of them, not all of them for sure. I mean, some of them, they are very responsible, but those autocrats, and also for the U.S. for very much leaving this vacuum on leading, Europe's EU states. I mean, leaving this vacuum, in particular the U.S. I mean, as a leader of the world, I mean, really leaving this vacuum where, and so being filmed by just one state with an agenda that's not. It probably the consequences may take some years to see, but in places like Angola, we are start seeing already, and unfortunately, that's something we need to rethink and hopefully change very soon, in order to save our democracy and improve our economy in Angola.
Yeah, thank you so much, Florindo. This was my pleasure to moderate this conversation with you. I hand it over to Matthew for final remarks. Matthew, you're muted.
A year into this, you would think that we would remember to unmute ourselves, right? Florindo and Dr. Ben Abdallah, thank you so much for this insightful conversation on a part of the world that honestly we don't think enough about. in Kansas City. And I think that to consider China's role in Africa, as well as China's role in South America and other parts of the world, is a really important part of the geopolitical conversation in 2021. So thank you so much for your insights, for your perspectives. Everyone, we hope that you'll continue to join us for upcoming Great Decisions conversations at the International Relations Council. Next month, we'll be looking at the Korean Peninsula, and we've got some other interesting programs coming up as well. So check us out at irckc.org. And again, Dr. Ben Abdallah and Florindo, thank you so much for joining us today. We'll see you again very soon. Take care.